Welcome to Gamers Platform. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Adam Wolf from Gamers Platform, and welcome to my very first tech analysis video here on the channel. Now, some of you might be asking, well, why are you doing this? Why now? You could have done this forever ago. I thought your channel was all about games, and of course it is. You can't have games without a little technology, and you know, I feel as though it's a right time for me personally to start doing these types of videos because I've been thinking about doing things a little differently, changing things up a little bit, and maybe getting some new type of content on the channel. Not new as in, oh, it's new to the internet, but new for my channel at least. And what better way to start off with new content than a tech analysis video? Here, the reason I'm doing this is because whenever you look online, say you are a PC gamer, you look online, you're looking for, you know, oh, well, what's going on with this particular game? You know, what kind of build do I need? What kind of processor, motherboard, graphics card, RAM? What do I need to run this particular game? And more than not, you're actually running into a lot of tutorials that deal with Intel builds, Intel processors, and NVIDIA graphics cards. And very rarely do you actually come across a build that actually is an AMD build. And so I feel as though there's just not enough videos out there that have somebody who's using an AMD processor. And I've always been curious about, well, what is, you know, if I can't find out if this game's good for my particular setup. As most of you know, I have recently purchased a GTX 1060. An EVGA GTX 1060 SSC 6GB graphics card that's super clocked, and that is actually what is recommended. Actually, what's recommended is the 3GB 1060 as a recommended spec for a piece of hardware for their game. I'm not sure about you guys, but I mean, if that's what's recommended, you would think that the game should be able to run at 1080p, 60 FPS, you know, max graphics or whatever. That is not the case, and so I was just curious. Now that I've got an NVIDIA card that's capable, and I've got my old AMD graphics card, which is an AMD R9 390 8GB from XFX. I can do a little bit of a, you know, comparison and see how the performance differs between the cards while still maintaining, of course, the processor that I have. But as for right now, we are testing on a Windows 7. I have an AMD FX 8370 Black Edition 8-core processor. That means it can be overclocked, but I am running this at stock 4.0 gigahertz. I am not much of an overclocker, but the most I will do is probably use AMD Overdrive to activate the turbo to boost it up to 4.3 gigahertz. But as of right now, for this test, I will be using just the stock frequency of 4.0 gigahertz. I have 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is the recommended specs, and of course, I will show you the recommended specs as we go along here that they list out are the recommended specs for this game, to run this game. Coming up first in the tech analysis is NVIDIA's graphics card, the GTX 1060 6GB, super clocked. On the left, you'll see my test. Now, the video itself is in 30 frames per second, but I did leave the frame rate counters up, and you will see on the left side, I left it at 60 FPS, or the 60 FPS cap, which is, you know, you do nothing. You just go into the game and you run it. And as you could see, the frame rate is just bouncing around all over the place. I couldn't even find a solid graphics settings at all, even on the lowest graphics settings. Now, keep in mind, this is roughly about medium-high graphics settings. This isn't ultra. Like, I didn't want to blow anything up. It's not going to blow anything up, but still. I didn't want to blow anything up, and so I wanted to see if I could hit 60 frames a second. So about medium to medium-high graphics settings, anti-aliasing is turned down to FXAA, and ambient occlusion is down to SSAO. And it was bouncing around a lot. You know, there are a lot of times where you'll see it hit 60, and then a lot of the time it spends under 60, and it's puzzling to me, because I've even dropped the settings down to the low preset, everything all the way down, lowest graphics settings, and it was still not hitting 60 frames a second, even though I supposedly hit the recommended system requirements for this game to run at 1080p. But they did mention that, you know, you should be expecting 1080p 30 FPS if you are looking to do 1080p with ultra graphic settings. But I am not doing ultra graphic settings. I'm just looking for the highest frame rate, and I still can't seem to hit it even on the lowest graphic settings. So in my opinion, and this is, by the way, on an SSD. So the SSD did not make much of a difference in terms of texture loading and object popping and stuff like that. So there definitely seems to be a bit of an optimization issue here, as you can see from the frame rate analysis. Now, again, I don't have all the fancy stuff that Digital Foundry does, but this is the best that I can do to show you guys what I had to go through to test these. And of course, on the right, you'll see that I have capped the frame rate at 30 FPS using NVIDIA's control panel. And if you want to know how to do that, you can take a look at this part right here. You go into the control panel, you go to 3D settings, okay, and then when the panel opens up, you go to program settings, not global settings. You want to make sure you choose the program settings, because what you're going to do is you're going to make it specific towards Andromeda. Look for Andromeda if it's not already on the list, which more than likely it won't be. Go to browse, then scroll down. Sometimes it'll be on the top of the list, but in my case it was a little bit further down. So scroll down, select Andromeda on the list. And then once that's loaded up all its options, you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see VSync, and you change it from use global settings to adaptive VSync half refresh rate. Then hit apply, and then exit out and go back into the game. In-game settings, you don't have to do anything. VSync you can keep enabled. Just make sure that it's in full screen, okay? Otherwise, the game will go back up to 60 FPS, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that happens with NVIDIA as well. And so just make sure it's in full screen, and you can leave VSync on, and the NVIDIA control panel will do the rest. And that's how you get 30 FPS. Now, in the 30 FPS scale of things, I actually cranked up the graphics settings, because the lower the frame rate that you bring it down to, the higher the graphics can go, which is a really nice thing about PC, is that you can customize everything, you know, whereas console is locked in. So on the at 30 FPS, I boosted everything, ultra preset, even not the ultra preset, because when you set the ultra preset, you can still there's still some settings that aren't maxed out. So usually you want to go to custom and then just max everything out yourself. And of course, playing at 1080p, you can see we get a pretty solid 30 frames a second. It's very rare that it drops under 30 FPS, but if it does, it's maybe about 3 FPS total. And it depends on what's in the scene. But for the most part, NVIDIA actually does really well handling 30 FPS. I personally enjoy their adaptive VSync, and I think it's probably the best option in terms of playing on the PC if you're looking to drop the frame rate down to 30 FPS. Now, moving on to AMD, this was interesting because on the one hand, again, on the left side, and this time I was using the in-game, the built-in frame rate counter. I completely forgot that most modern-day EA games you can open up the control or command console and then just type in simple commands to pull up the frames per second. But the reason I say the AMD was interesting because when I was running this with my R9 390, okay, just to reiterate, I am running with the XFX AMD Radeon R9 390 8GB graphics card, double dissipation, I think it's called. This graphics card is actually not that bad. The only reason I went with a 1060 is because, or I changed to a 1060 was because when your very modern AMD graphics card can't seem to handle a game that's 6 years old, there might be an issue. So, anyway, getting sidetracked here. when it came to the AMD card, same settings, about medium to high graphics settings. Obviously, no HBAO for ambient occlusion. Doesn't make much sense to run it since that's an NVIDIA graphic settings usually. And then, of course, AAA or anti-aliasing is down to FXAA, not temporal anti-aliasing. I did not run temporal anti-aliasing at all on any of these tests. And of course, as usual, on the left you can see the unlocked frame rate, or the frame rate that, is supposed to go up to 60 FPS, and on the right you can see that I've locked it at 30 FPS. If you're curious as to how to go about doing this, it took me a while to figure out how the frame rate limiter in AMD Crimson actually worked. But if you go into AMD Crimson, you can go into your global settings if you want to, but again, specify the game that you want to change the settings on. In this case, I of course chose Mass Effect Andromeda. You go into those settings, there's the frame rate limit down at the bottom, you turn that on, and then take the bar down to 30 FPS. Now, in terms of the vertical sync, activating vertical sync in here, you can activate it if you want to. I personally can't seem to figure out whether it's working or not, because every time I turn it on, it doesn't seem to be working. I still see tons of screen tearing on my screen. And the only reason I mention this is because in game you actually have to turn off VSync. Okay, in game you actually have to turn off VSync, and you have to make sure it's in full screen. For those of you who are PC gamers, full screen and no VSync equals tons of screen tearing, and it's the worst thing to look at. But for AMD's Crimson, you do have to turn off VSync, whereas NVIDIA's side you do not, which is why I activated the VSync in Crimson, but it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. I personally don't see anything different about it. So now, although the AMD R9 has 2 gigs more of VRAM than the GTX 1060, that doesn't seem to be a huge factor in how well the game runs. I will say this though, oddly enough, on the R9, the game actually ran more consistently rather than the way that NVIDIA's card ran it, which was on the side of a lot of stuttering. I'm not saying there wasn't any stuttering on the AMD side, but it was more due to, frame rate drops and stuff like that. Whereas on the NVIDIA side, even if I got 60 FPS, there was still quite a bit of frame pacing. I'm going to chalk it up to frame pacing, and that sentiment was actually echoed by Digital Foundry's analysis of the current gen systems, PS4, Xbox One, and PC. So, more or less on the console side, but I personally believe that it also is happening on PC side. And so, as you can see, it seems to be running just fine. However, once you get to the Planet EOS on AMD's card, the frame rate does stay below 30 FPS. It's a bit much, and, tweaking the settings, I'm sure, turning down shadows, changing the anti-aliasing, turning down ambient occlusion, and turning down some of the settings, you can probably get a solid locked 30 FPS even with the AMD card. But, again, this is on Ultra. There's a reason for that. And it does seem as though that even in the heaviest of areas, NVIDIA's graphics card does come out on top on the 30 FPS side. But it's not to say that you cannot actually play it with an AMD card. That, I think, is pretty much going to do it. I didn't mean for this video to be super long. Probably going to be cutting quite a bit. But I just wanted to give you guys a heads up as to, how this has been acting from my perspective, from my testing, from what I've been doing the last couple days, because, I've been trying to figure out the right way to play the game, or the proper way to play the game. And also, I wanted to shed some light on the fact that AMD users do exist. Okay, there are some people out there that do have AMD FX processors. Now, there's probably some people that have Ryzen processors and stuff like that. So, and there's not enough videos or tutorials or tech analysis videos that deal with, AMD processors. They're not the best. The old ones aren't anyway. but they still are here, and some of us are still using them. And so I think it's important that if somebody else out there is like me and has an AMD 8350 or 8370, both the same. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for checking out my first tech analysis video. If it did help you out, I'm really glad. You can leave a comment down below letting me know what your situation is. Let me know if you've got an AMD processor, graphics card, or both. If it did help you out, just give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, or you're a console gamer, I'm sorry, this is not for you. You can give it a thumbs down if you want, and definitely be on the lookout for more tech analysis videos in the future, because I actually enjoyed doing this, and I really hope to maybe help with the AMD side of things, because I think it's important, again, that we do have a variety in the industry. As always, guys, I'm Adam Wolf, and I will see you guys in the next one.